Chapter 9. Marx Sees Through the Material World. In this chapter, we'll learn about capitalism's secrets, idealism versus materialism, ideological strategies, realism's pros and cons, and speaking of subtexts. Let's go back to Plato's allegory of the cave. The point of the story is that we're all prisoners of the cave, watching false shadow puppet shows on the wall, and our ultimate goal is to escape into the truth of light outside. The romantic poet critics responded by saying something like, well, those shadows mean something too, so let's hear it for the inspired, creative poet puppeteers who bring the truth to you. Marxist critics have a different interpretation. They want to show you who's really behind those shadow puppets, and it sure isn't a group of sensitive artists connected to divine inspiration. The real puppet master is the capitalist system, keeping its captive audience entertained and imprisoned at the same time. The system wants you to stay in your place and accept its imaginary stories as truth. Marxist critics want you to see that the shadows are not natural or neutral, but they have an agenda. They even have histories. Not only that, but even the most escapist stories you're enjoying are integrally connected to your humdrum material life, and vice versa. Why are these critics being so mean? Immersed in the system. Marxist critics aren't really being mean. They're being helpful. They argue that because you're a social being, everything you read, watch, build, buy, and use is related to everything else in the social system on some level. And these levels can go very deep. You can immediately recognize some of the levels, such as knowing that any product you buy is probably the result of a long, complicated process. Cars and shoes don't just grow on trees, you know. Other levels are more subtle, and Marxist critics have shown that literary analysis can actually help illuminate the deep connections as much as the more visible ones. Why do you need to work so hard to see these connections? Because, according to Marxist critics, it's a built-in feature of any existing economic system, and especially capitalist systems, to hide or mystify their real operations behind a false worldview. According to Marxists, capitalist systems exploit your labor and manipulate your human potential for the benefit of the rich and powerful. The last thing the system wants, even if some of the rich and powerful themselves don't mind, although they usually do, is for you to really understand how this exploitation works, since that would help you fight the system. Central to Marxist criticism, then, is the project of revealing how your real, basic social relations are hidden behind the false images perpetuated in society. But still, you might ask, isn't literature different? Doesn't art provide a space of imagination and creativity that offers a break from real-world issues? Marxist critics say yes and no. What you see as an escape, they see as actually becoming more imprisoned in the system. The more you simply absorb stories without thinking of their connections to real-world operations, the more actively you become part of the dominant class's exploitative agenda. For Marxist critics, every literary work is a product of its time. It doesn't matter whether Jane Austen or Stephen King actively thought about socio-political issues when they were writing, although they probably did. Intention like that isn't necessary, because evidence of the author's involvement in the world can always be found in their work. In other words, Marxist critics begin with the understanding that the elements of human social interaction always flow through any human production. Developing new ways of acting on this knowledge means improving the human condition as well. Alma materialism. Marxist critics also begin by seeing the material world as the basis of all consciousness. This might seem obvious. It sounds pretty organic, after all. But we often think of the relationship exactly backward. When you ask Plato or the Romantics to tell you how to get ideas into your head, they'll say it has to do with inspiration of one kind or another. For Plato, ideas exist in pure form outside of the physical world, but divine forces and philosophers can help you get closer to them. The Romantics will tell you it has to do with imagination and the natural creativity of the human mind. And poets can help you with that. In both cases, ideas come first. Getting to the truth for them means getting closer to an ideal. Ideas and ideals, in fact, team up very nicely in the term idealism. Marxists argue against idealism and for materialism. They explain that ideas and everything else in your head, your whole way of seeing things, develop out of your involvement in human society. This orientation towards consciousness is called materialism, because it begins with the material world as the driving force behind any abstractions or ideas you end up calling your own. And for Marxists, the material world is specifically defined as a world of economic and political organization and social interaction. Being human means being a social animal, one that learns, consciously and unconsciously, from its own manufactured environment. But wait, there's more. Every social environment has two interrelated aspects. A society's economic base is the foundation of economic realities in any given society. Who owns property and controls wealth, how things get made, how labor is organized, and where profits go. A society's superstructure is made up of all those features and institutions we generally think of as that society's defining characteristics. Its philosophy, art, and cultural traditions, but also its religions, laws, and even political parties. Marxists emphasize that the superstructure is made up of all the social benefits and institutions that the economic base needs to ensure its own survival. Really? To ensure its own survival? Yes. Socio-political systems are incredibly self-serving. Marxist critics emphasize that capitalist superstructures work very subtly and successfully to mystify their operations and keep you from understanding your contribution to the economic base and how material circumstances, rather than so-called freely formed ideas, shape your consciousness. Let's simplify things. One aspect of this mystification is getting you to see processes as products. Reification, pronounced reification, is what happens when you think of anything created through human labor as simply an object, or you ignore its economic and political dimensions. When you reify things, you can reify people too, you see them in isolation, as products, rather than as integral parts in a system. In fact, you tend to see reified things and people like pre-cut puzzle pieces that fit into whatever worldview or storyline is dominant at the time. Think of manufactured goods and technological processes, for example. Many things can seem so complicated that we just disregard any sense of detail and go along with the reification of processes into commodities. We just use the phone or the coffee maker, wear shoes, or click through the internet without having to face the historical forces and human associations of a product's development, the material demands put on workers, or, in the case of the internet, the exhaustive collection of data by commercial interests. Clearly, it's a lot easier for most of us to think of buying, selling, using, and craving commodities rather than processes. Forget about all the detailed history, labor, and seemingly endless complications. Just give me the stuff. This, by the way, is also what Marx called a commodity fetish. We're drawn to the end product to satisfy our desires, and we're alienated from the processes involved. Marxist critics argue that this alienation is bad for you in two ways. As a consumer, alienation from processes helps you mindlessly contribute to the system's exploitation of human labor. As a producer, you find it difficult to recognize even your own participation in a finished product, a relationship, or in society. As you might imagine, when Marxist literary critics consider the new critics' argument that literary work should be studied as well-wrought urns, verbal icons, or other unified organic wholes, see Chapter 3, they see reification. And while Marxist approaches to literature come in a variety of styles and always adapt to new social circumstances, they all see literature as a material process. What you're looking at when you read is not an autonomous, self-contained work, but part of a socioeconomic system. Living the dream. Reifying literature, therefore, strips away a text's history, relations, and encodings as part of the superstructure. As a remedy, Marxist criticism urges you not to take texts at face value merely as products, but to investigate their involvement in social processes and even mystification. And when you do this, when you try to uncover or decode the ways that the superstructure hides the harsh motivations of the economic base, you get the kinds of rereadings that make Marxists Marxist and tend to aggravate non-Marxists. For example, did legal marriage first develop out of love? No, the superstructure merely offers you this fantasy to hide the system's real motivation, which involves property rights for men. Celibacy for the clergy? That's all about property laws, too, ensuring that nothing can be inherited by children, just the church. Religion in general? Marx covers that with his famous line that religion is the opium of the people. Legal systems? They're designed to keep all the power and money where it is, in the hands of the few. Educational institutions? They serve to mass-produce new generations of capitalist workers. Leisure time? Not designed for escape, but conditioned by the economic system to reinforce your willing participation in labor and consumerism. An important term for the stories that societies live by is ideology. It's a common term and not used exclusively by Marxist critics. For example, if you say that someone has a liberal or conservative ideology, you're referring to that person's consciously held beliefs or point of view. For our discussion, however, ideology is used a bit differently. Here, it refers to the whole system of mystification that turns the unfair and exploitative aspects of an economic system into an agreeable narrative, or worse, a narrative presented as simply inevitable. That's just the way things have always been. Either way, ideologies serve to legitimize society's dominant economic class interests. Wake up and smell the ideology. What's particularly interesting about Marxist literary criticism is that ideology can be seen in two different but related modes. In one mode, ideology is emphasized as a kind of brainwashing, or a set of ideas that keep you from seeing reality. This has also been called false consciousness. But in another mode, ideology is emphasized as the actions you perform on an everyday basis. That is, you don't just think ideology, you live it. Ideology goes from being an illusion that keeps you from seeing the truth, to being a lived reality, a set of practices and enacted beliefs that physically produces the system's fictional worldview. The history of ideological critique in Marxist literary theory is vast, various, and deeply related to world history. Get real. In the years following the Russian Revolution, 1917, one of the most significant literary movements to emerge from the Soviet Union was socialist realism. This was a movement expressly designed by Communist Party leaders to bring revolutionary messages to the masses. Writers, according to Stalin, were to be the engineers of the human soul, building up the consciousness of the working class through depictions of strength, optimism, and progress of communist society. In this regard, literary works were regulated in order to have the most beneficial impact. Needless to say, many writers reacted against the strict imposition of style and subject, leading to subversive variations of the official theories, exile, and even imprisonment. Advocates of socialist realism maintained that such stringent artistic rules were necessary for the good of society, and that making labor the principal hero of our books was perfectly good propaganda. In fact, while it has a generally negative connotation, the term propaganda actually comes from the Latin term for propagating religious faith and is used approvingly for any form of art that sends a specifically desired message. While the realism in socialist realism was reduced to only those aspects of life that glorified the working class, one of the most important Marxist literary theories of the early 20th century took another look at the kind of realism we're more familiar with, the realism of the 19th century European novel. The Hungarian critic György Lukács, 1885 to 1971, pronounced Lukács, has become associated with the term reflectionist to describe a Marxist approach to literature that values the depiction of life without the idealization demanded by socialist realism. Yet why would reflecting life as it appears be specifically advocated by a Marxist critic? Because, according to Lukács, good realist novels do not just reflect details mindlessly, like a mirror. Instead, they reflect, in all their details and multiple plot lines, the social contradictions important to the Marxist worldview. In this way, reflectionism suggests both mirroring and reflecting on a society's actual arguments and inequalities. Lukács pointed to the work of authors such as Charles Dickens, George Eliot, Leo Tolstoy, Walter Scott, Honoré de Balzac, and Thomas Mann as showing realistic characters struggling against real problems. Advocating what he called critical realism, Lukács argued that readers of these works were offered an intensive or artistic totality that reflects the extensive totality of society itself. The novels, in other words, can reveal what is really true about a society, not just what it looks like even to its participants. Realism, in this way, reflects on the whole system, all due to the artistic transformations achieved by the writers. As Lukács put it, the fictional worlds created by realist novels gave readers reflections of life in the greatest concreteness and clarity with all its motivating contradictions. Does this mean that Lukács thought all these writers were socialists themselves? Not at all. He explained that it didn't matter whether or not the authors themselves were trying to be revolutionary in their depictions. Like Engels himself, Lukács greatly admired Balzac because, despite being a reactionary, the political opposite of a revolutionary, Balzac produced works with the same kind of richness and contradiction as society itself, and these works would then be open to being understood in a socially progressive way. The concept of contradiction is important to Lukács and other Marxist critics because of a process called dialectical materialism. This comes down to the idea that any existing society may look coherent and whole, but within it exist contradictions and tensions, such as the inequalities and exploitation within the capitalist system. According to dialectical logic, these internal contradictions increase in severity until they overturn the existing society, as in a revolution, and the result is a new system in which the earlier contradictions are resolved. And, you guessed it, the process starts over again, since any new system will contain contradictions. The three repeating steps are also referred to as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Marx argued that when a truly communist society was achieved, classes would no longer contain the internal contradictions that lead to dialectical development. According to Lukács, when you read David Copperfield, Middlemarch, or Anna Karenina, you are given the chance to see events, objects, cities, and above all, people, not as isolated entities, but as parts of a working system. Lukács was vitally opposed to the fragmentation and alienation that he saw society inflicting on people, and because of this, he not only championed realism, but condemned much of modernism. Shocking audiences worldwide. Marxists certainly appreciate modern progress, but Lukács was specifically opposed to modernist literary works that depicted fragmented, static, and introverted views of life. What he meant was that much modernist literature, the kinds of works published by James Joyce or Virginia Woolf, for example, featured characters and situations that seemed static, without time or history. Rather than depicting society as a whole, modernist works overemphasized, in Lukács' view, the alienation from society that characters felt. The technique of stream of consciousness narration, for example, in which you seem to read narrators' thoughts from within their own minds, was particularly troubling. Here was a character's isolated, alienated self on display for all to see, with none of the realist benefits of context and dialectic. Simply put, Lukács said that while alienation was an actual social truth, simply depicting it in literature was not going to help anybody. Seen from this critical approach, all modernism was doing was reflecting the alienated state of modern life itself, uncritically and without giving the reader a way out. It's a surrender to the subjectivity that you should be trying to improve or escape. Lukács, thinking of writers like Joyce, Kafka, Beckett, Faulkner, and Musil, wrote, "Man, for these writers, is by nature solitary, asocial, unable to enter into relationships with other human beings. Not only that, but there's another problem. Modernism doesn't historicize. By isolating characters and their thoughts, the very inner world of a human being is turned into a cynical, frightening, directionless spirit. While Lukács condemned modernist techniques that depicted individuals in fragmentary, frightened isolation, another Marxist critic, a German playwright in fact, celebrated modernism for those very same reasons. Bertolt Brecht, 1898 to 1956, argued that art was needed to wake people up to the capitalist exploitation they experienced, but usually ignored or couldn't understand. Mystification and ideology are powerful weapons, Brecht knew, and he worked to counter them with modernist art forms that he hoped would be just as powerful. Fighting fire with fire was the basis of Brecht's alienation effect, by which audiences of his plays would be confronted with non-traditional features, such as posters and placards describing the actions on stage, actors talking directly to the audience, sometimes in groups like a Greek chorus, plot lines left unresolved, and any number of surprising or shocking methods of keeping the audience from merely watching a play. Calling himself anti-Aristotelian, Brecht did not simply disregard traditional artistic rules, but highlighted them in exaggerated ways so that they could never be taken as natural. Brecht wanted to provoke and maintain the audience's awareness of the constructed nature of the play, and by extension, of society. Like the Russian formalists, see Chapter 4, Brecht believed that defamiliarization helps people really observe what they only think they see every day. The active role the audience had to play when at Brecht's theater was the active role citizens should take as they face their alienation and exploitation at home and at work. To this end, Brecht's alienation effect was achieved through presenting social contradictions and inequalities as brutal or shocking, showing them to be unnatural, not just unfortunate. Brecht's message was, and is, don't let the price of bread, the lack of work, or the declaration of war seem inevitable, like acts of nature. Show their historical dependence on human exploitation. This is a message that responds directly to the dominant ideology by calling its bluff on the spin it gives to actual power relations. Return of the repressed. Marxist critics in the latter half of the 20th century began developing a wide range of ideological critique. The British critic Terry Eagleton, for example, urged an emphasis on the mode of production for any given work. What matters in a literary work, that is not just its content, but its own material existence. Oral literature differs from print, and print differs from online texts in ways that should be factored into an investigation of how the work functions in an ideology. Eagleton also called attention to the multiple ideological spheres that a work might be examined in. We've been talking primarily, for example, about ideology in its general circumstances, concerning all of society. But a work can also be analyzed with regard to the specific ideology of its author, or to the ideology of the artistic principles that dominate any given era. Speaking of analysis, another area of Marxist theory that developed in the 1960s combines ideological critique with psychological analysis. These theories suggest that ideology, as a socially acceptable version of real economic relations, acts to repress things that are unacceptable, namely, all those contradictions and tensions in capitalism. Repression pushes these unapproved features away, keeping you from getting a good look at them. Literary analysis, however, can uncover or reveal what's being repressed, or at least indicate that something has been repressed in the first place. The French critic, Pierre Machelet, and the American critic, Frederick Jameson, for example, have argued that you can investigate this repression by first recognizing that all literary works actively try to reconcile the inconsistencies between the ideology of what a society imagines itself to be and the material arrangements of what it really is. That is, literary works try to do this, but they always fail. Solutions to the problem of covering up contradictions are tried out in texts that seem to create coherent, unified systems, such as realist novels, as we've seen, but ultimately the solutions fail to fully uphold the ideology. Critics of this sort, therefore, read rather like psychoanalysts, looking for what David Richter has called blind spots left by what the ideology of an age is unable to talk about. And this is even true of nonfiction writing as well. Marx himself, according to a later Marxist critic, read books on economics with an eye for gaps and slips, evidence of what the authors were unable to face and incapable of expressing. See Chapter 17 for how the deconstructionists approach gaps and slips in the text. So what Jameson called the political unconscious has become the basis for analyzing literature. In fact, for Jameson, it's not only literature that can be studied this way, but all the arts, including architecture and pretty much anything else made or even interpreted by human sensibilities. See Chapter 19's discussion of postmodernism for more. The bottom line? You live in and rely on a social system loaded with unfairness and exploitation. And while you try to ignore the contradictions and live according to a more reasonable storyline, ideology, your political unconscious is always at work trying to expose the illusion. At some level, you feel guilty. In fact, the whole system feels guilty. The real solution? Work toward understanding and improving the social and historical forces around you. If that doesn't do the trick, well, Dr. Freud will see you in the next chapter. The least you need to know. Economic systems hide their true nature. Examine things as parts of a process, not as isolated objects. Ideology creates and employs literary features. A literary work's content can be seen to reflect society's contradictions, and a literary work's form can be seen to reveal society's inability to keep its story straight.